Before we get into mud, rats, and the reality of trench warfare, let me ask you something. If you stripped away modern survival gear, GPS, Gore-Tex, and freeze-dried meals, could you last a week in a World War I trench? Not on a camping trip, not on a TV set. In a flooded, lice-infested ditch, under constant artillery fire, where disease killed more men than bullets. That's the test that forged an entire generation of soldiers. Today we're going to look at that world through a modern survival lens and ask a provocative question. If Bear Grylls were forced to survive in a World War I trench, what unorthodox items would he secretly want in his kit? Not the obvious things everyone talks about, but the overlooked tools that actually kept men alive. If you care about real history, practical survival, and lessons that still apply today, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Strange History now, because we don't retell history, we interrogate it. Now let's get straight into the mud. Why trench survival was less about heroics and more about systems. The popular image of World War I focuses on bayonet charges and explosions, but survival in the trenches was mostly about managing slow, grinding threats. Cold, damp, infection, malnutrition, psychological collapse, and vermin were the daily enemies. Soldiers didn't die because they lacked courage, they died because their systems failed. Bear Grylls often talks about survival as managing energy, exposure, and morale. World War I soldiers learned this the hard way. The items we're about to discuss weren't glamorous, but they were decisive. Each one solved a specific trench problem, and each has a modern survival equivalent that still works today. Why a simple candle mattered more than a knife. One of the most quietly valuable items in a trench was a plain tallow candle. Not for romance or comfort, but for control. Trenches were dark even during the day, especially in dugouts. Candles provided light for medical treatment, map reading, weapon maintenance, and letter writing, which mattered more for morale than most people realize. A modern survivalist can apply this lesson by prioritizing low-energy, reliable light sources over complex electronics. A candle works when batteries die, when water soaks everything else, and when silence matters. In World War I, soldiers learned to shield flames with tin cups or helmets to avoid detection. That same technique works today in blackout conditions where light discipline matters. Why a spare sock was a medical tool, not clothing. Trench foot was one of the most feared conditions of the war. Constant exposure to cold and moisture caused tissue breakdown, infection, and sometimes amputation. The unorthodox lifesaver wasn't medicine, it was dry socks. Officers drilled into men the importance of changing socks multiple times a day, even when exhausted. Soldiers were taught to massage their feet and dry them whenever possible. Bear Grylls emphasizes foot care constantly, and this is why, in modern survival scenarios, neglecting foot health leads to immobilization. Why a tin of grease could save your life. Soldiers carried grease not for weapons, but for skin. Cold, wet conditions cracked hands and faces, opening the door to infection. Animal fat or petroleum jelly acted as a barrier against wind and moisture. This wasn't comfort, it was preventive medicine. Modern survivalists can use the same principle with lip balm, petroleum jelly, or animal fat rendered in the field. Applied to exposed skin, it reduces heat loss and prevents micro-injuries. World War I soldiers often smeared grease before night duty, knowing frostbite didn't announce itself until damage was done. Why a shaving kit doubled as disease control? It sounds trivial until you understand lice. Body lice carried trench fever, which incapacitated thousands. Regular shaving reduced lice habitat and made inspections easier. Soldiers who shaved and cleaned regularly were statistically healthier. Bear Grylls often emphasizes hygiene in survival, not for comfort but for longevity. In modern austere conditions, grooming tools help prevent parasites, infections, and skin breakdown. A razor is not cosmetic, it's a health tool. World War I trenches proved that personal discipline could outperform primitive medicine. Why were paper and pencil considered psychological armor? Well, letters weren't just a means of communication, you know. They acted as anchors to identity. Writing helped stabilize soldiers mentally and preserved a sense of self that extended beyond the confines of the trench. Diaries, in particular, allowed men to process trauma and maintain some kind of routine. Bear Grylls often talks about mindset being the hidden pillar of survival, and, honestly, modern survivalists can learn from this by journaling during isolation, stress, or extended emergencies. Writing things down clarifies decisions, helps track resources, and importantly, preserves morale. In fact, soldiers during the First World War who wrote regularly often coped better with prolonged stress, something that modern psychology now confirms. You might wonder why a small mirror was considered a tactical tool. Well, pocket mirrors enabled soldiers to observe over the edges of trenches without exposing themselves to danger. And no, it wasn't about vanity at all. It was reconnaissance. In fact, periscopes actually evolved from this very simple concept. Now, regarding alcohol, it wasn't really about courage, but rather sanitation. While rum rations are often romanticized, the real value of alcohol was in its antiseptic properties and its role in controlled morale management. The common thread running through all these items is, quite simply, systems thinking. Soldiers in the First World War managed to survive when they paid attention to light, skin, feet, hygiene, morale, awareness, and infection. Bear Grylls' modern philosophy, honestly, aligns perfectly with this trench survival doctrine. Survival is boring, repetitive, disciplined, and, above all, deeply human. The trenches stripped survival down to its bare essentials, and those lessons still apply today, whether you're in deserts, jungles, mountains, or even cities after disasters. Studying First World War trench survival isn't just nostalgia, it's about stress-testing human systems under extreme pressure. Modern technology fails, discipline doesn't. The men who survived the trenches didn't make it because they were fearless, but because they managed the unglamorous details relentlessly. That's the lesson Bear Grylls would recognize straight away. So, if this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, go ahead and subscribe to Strange History. Share this with someone who thinks survival is just about the gear instead of the systems. And really, stay with us, because history still has a lot to teach those who are willing to listen.